Hello and welcome to our daily sketching routine. It is Sunday, October 27th, 2024. And today's video will be a little different, but also the same in the sense that it's the daily sketching routine and I'm going to be sketching. But it'll be different in the sense that if you're new, I post every day, that's a given, but then I usually do a 5-minute timer. But today I'm just gonna talk, and if it's a long video, then it'll be a long video. But it'll be fun, so yeah, if you wanna hear me talking, you'll have that, but if you just want to see sketching, you can have that too. But it'll be art related and creativity related and story related. And part of that is because I guess the topic of the sketching is this character that I just called D, codename D. The project I'm working on is Project D. And I keep the names to myself just because I feel like there's power in names, and plus sometimes I change them, so there's that. But she's basically the main character, and just to get warmed up, I'm gonna start sketching. So this part I like to call shop talk. So basically I am practicing, so these are some of the things that I'm practicing, is drawing from imagination, so there's that, which is my favorite thing to do as far as drawing is concerned, and I've gotten pretty good at it. But the more challenging thing is making videos while I'm drawing, so speaking. So that's the kind of challenging thing, and also it's challenging to just draw from imagination anyway. So I gotta get warmed up. But yeah, during this shop talk portion, basically I really like this pen and paper, and if you're not someone who draws a whole lot, it might be kind of boring to hear me talk about pen and paper, but I kind of love it, so I never get tired of that, since I use it a lot. And this paper is pretty good. I mentioned that before I started making these videos consistently, which has only been about not even 6 months, maybe almost 6 months, I'm not sure. But I was working at a place that did bindery work, like book binding. So I actually made this and had to trim the paper down and everything, and this was a test book, because you have to run a test to see if it comes out okay. And so I just held on to the like the test books. I have a couple of them, and the paper's not bad. It's thin, so you can see through it, but it works well with this. But the paper that works really well with this felt tip, it's a Papermate felt tip pen, is like nice printer paper. I have some HP printer paper, and it's really great. I like it. So I would actually draw the comic on that paper. And so yeah, I like that. And then other pens are any kind of brush pen. I just have like a few of these, a couple of these. I actually want to go get some more pens. And so as I'm recording this is actually the middle of the night, which sometimes I have so many ideas that I have to get up and draw. But I probably won't post this in the middle of the night. And also sometimes you get the best sort of state of flow. But yeah, going back to the pen here, if you're doing what I'm doing, which is just sketching with pen, like out of your imagination, you're going to mess up like this. So it's good to have some kind of whiteout like paint to fix your mistakes. And yeah, let's talk about this character a bit. So her code name is D, and so one of the, I'll probably call this video something about role-playing games, because that's ultimately what I'm going to be talking about. I just wanted to get warmed up with the sketching and also speaking, but yeah, it'll kind of just come back around to role-playing. So she was a character that I had mentioned in character creation, that some of the characters in the story that I'm writing, it's like a multi-volume story, is came from playing Dungeons and Dragons, and I had created characters for that. But I've just always been into role-playing games anyway, so with Dungeons and Dragons being like the popular one, like the main one, but yeah, I'll just kind of like give a bit of background, my origin story as far as role-playing games, and I find it kind of interesting, at least to myself, and maybe to whoever's listening. If not, there's always the sketching, okay? And I'm just gonna keep the zoom, but I'll do my best to keep this in camera. So my first introduction to role-playing type stuff would be, wasn't even really like a role-playing game, but so I grew up poor, just so some background info, and we would go to the, like, my mom would take me to the thrift store. This was back when thrift stores were not trendy. Like, poor people went to thrift stores. And one of my favorite things was they had a like discount book bin, and it was just like a bunch of random books in there, but that was like my favorite thing, because you could get like a book for 10 cents or something, and so I would just get as many as I could get away with, like that my mom would buy me. And sometimes it would be some really great things. It could be like a series or something, and so yeah, that was like my favorite thing. And so I got introduced to a lot of pretty cool things, like that's where I bought my first like Peanuts like collection, like Charlie Brown. So they had, I would always be on the lookout for those, and then sometimes they would have like a collection of them, and so that was one of my favorite things to read, and other book series. But one of them was the Choose Your Own Adventure, and I loved those. And yeah, like I would always be on the lookout for those. So that was really my first kind of intro to role-playing, because it was kind of like role-playing. And yeah, I just loved those Choose Your Own Adventure books. And they would have like cool covers and some illustrations inside of them, and they're just the best. And then I think what happened was, one day they had it was kind of like a role-playing game, but it was like choose your own adventure, but you had to have dice, or like a six-sided die. But my mom, for her own reason, like, she didn't want me to have that because it was kind of like gambling or something. And so I didn't have dice. But then the book was saying how you could like cut up like little pieces of paper, and like that would be the dice. Like you just randomly pick out the paper, and so that was cool. And yeah, like that was like a step up. That was like a level up, so to speak. And so that was really my first kind of intro to like role-playing games. And then when we started getting a little bit more money and not having to go to the thrift store for books, I discovered malls, and then they had like Walden Books. That was amazing. That was my favorite place. And then there were like more books like that, and they actually had like D&D solo adventure. And so that was actually my first intro to like D&D. Was playing like the solo adventure books, and I loved it. I mean, I thought it was great. And then of course like the game system started having role-playing games, and so I played like Final Fantasy, played Phantasy Star. But I have a funny story about Phantasy Star, which kind of goes with like the role-playing thing. Like I don't know how maybe I bought it cheap from like a friend, but like I got the Sega system, and so back then we didn't have the internet or anything, so the Sega system that I bought had Phantasy Star. Like it came with, from the friend, like he had that, and I didn't know anything about role-playing games. That might have been my first video game that was like an RPG, and I didn't know anything about it, so I started playing it, and I was like, what is this? I was looking for things to shoot at and fight, and then it kept, like, Phantasy Star, the original one, had the most ridiculous sort of encounters. Like it was just constant. Like every few steps there's just like a random encounter, and I didn't know anything about it, so I'm like, what is this? And there were no instructions, and I was playing it with my friend, like another friend, and we were like, what is this? It was his introduction to RPGs too. And we were just figuring it out, like, oh, you have to like select this like action and that kind of thing. I mean, now we take all of that for granted, but when you don't know anything about it, it was really weird. But then once you get into it, you're like, oh, okay. But we didn't know about healing potions. We didn't know how to buy and sell anything. And and then Phantasy Star happens to be a really like pretty tough game to like start your RPG adventures with, and that was funny. But I kind of have I have a lot of nostalgia for like Phantasy Star, and then I got into like the other ones. Like they were really cool. But I had the Sega more than I had like the Nintendo. Like I would borrow my friend's Nintendo, so I didn't play as much of like Final Fantasy. But anyway, that was a little side story there. But then going back to the other thing, so that's kind of how I got into D&D. Was just like the solo adventure book that they had, and so I knew about it, but I had never actually role played, and I kind of stuck with like that section at Walden Books, was the kind of like the fantasy story section. and 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 yeah, I got into like the video games and stuff. So yeah, it was I always kind of knew about it. And then I actually, my first sort of really getting into, so I discovered the section in the bookstore that had the role-playing games, and it wasn't, I actually didn't get into D&D. And then I discovered comics. That was like the other thing, was I got into comics. And so I'd go to the comic book store and they would have the section for comics, and like I got into like X-Men comics. That was like my favorite. And so yeah, that was really fun. And it was on the way home from school, and so I never really had the money. I only had like a little bit of money, but I would just spend a lot of time just browsing and stuff, and I could only buy like a few comics. And so I actually got into comics. That's like another story for maybe another day, but I actually got into comics before like RPGs. But yeah, I'll talk about that another time. But yeah, I could only buy like a few comics, and so I got into X-Men, and but there was like another section like on the other side where they had the role-playing games, and so I was always kind of aware of them, but I didn't know what they were. But then the first role-playing game I actually bought was because it was Robotech, and like I really liked that cartoon. And again, this was before like YouTube and stuff, so that was really my introduction to like anime, was Robotech. And so I bought the book, the role-playing game, which I didn't understand. They had all these charts, but I really liked the illustrations because they had like all this stuff from Macross, which I didn't know. Like I didn't know the difference. I didn't know that that's what it was. I just called it Robotech. But yeah, they had like these awesome illustrations, and so I just bought it for that. And I would just trace those things. I would trace like all those Robotech illustrations like constantly. That's kind of how I learned to draw, actually. And I would just ignore like the role-playing game part, like literally just skip over it, because it looked like a textbook. And so I did that for a while. I would just trace, and then I mean I would draw it also, like poorly draw it, but I mean I pretty much got a reputation for the kid that like drew and stuff. So so yeah, again, before the internet, I mean, if whatever reputation you had, you sort of became that. So I was the art kid. And this is still in camera. And it wasn't until maybe a few years later, or maybe a couple of years or something, that I actually sat down and read the book. And it started off with a scenario, and it reminded me of like the D&D thing. So I was like, oh, okay, like it's kind of the same thing, because it was describing, imagine that you're like this and then this happened, then what are you gonna do, like that kind of thing, like a tutorial. And I was like, yeah, like this is similar to the D&D book. So but the thing is, it had a lot more dice, and that was my introduction to like all the weird role-playing game dice, because it was saying you roll a d10, and I'm like, what is that? And yeah, like I couldn't just do the trick of using sheets of paper for the six-sided. I didn't understand it, and it wasn't set up to be like a solo thing. It was set up to actually be played as a role-playing game, and so I kind of just put that on the back burner. And so that was really my first intro to what an actual role-playing game was, and it happened to be kind of a complicated one at that. It wasn't really made for beginners. And so my introduction to D&D, which again, this is kind of a long story, but let's just stick with like the D&D part. So my first real introduction to that was in school, and I had a friend who had one of the original like rule books, and is this on camera? Okay. And yeah, I said, hey, can I look at that? So we're in the middle of class, and I was like, can I look at that? And it was kind of like the Robotech book, where it had examples of how to role play and stuff like that. And I mean, I was hooked. I was like, oh wow, this is awesome. And since it was like a basic kind of beginner D&D book, it gave you like a solo adventure and stuff, and it did a better job of explaining like what all the different things were. And so then the next step was to go buy the dice, because I had seen them, but they were magical. I didn't know what they were. So I had seen them in the comic book store, and so I finally got the money and like the courage to just buy these dice. And yeah, I was hooked at that point. I was a D&D nerd at that point, except that I actually just stuck with like kind of the solo stuff. Like I would make characters and everything, but I never really sat down to play, because that's was kind of a challenge sometimes to actually get people to play it and stuff. It just never kind of happened. So it wasn't until a few years later that when I like moved schools and stuff, so I made some new friends who were into D&D, and I was kind of like part of the freaks and geeks kind of crowd, honestly. I wasn't really a nerd, because I did art, so I wasn't really thought of as like a nerd, and I'm not really that nerdy, although like I can be, because I'm more artistic. But so the group that probably the closest would be like Freaks and Geeks, that show, if you've ever seen it. It's pretty similar. So it was pretty eclectic. Like there would be people who were into music or into art or into like D&D or into like smoking weed and stuff, and so I just I didn't really care. But yeah, that was actually kind of how I got into D&D, because I just kind of hung out with like the freaks and geeks, and so they were like, yeah, you want to play D&D, and it was an actual group and an actual game. So that was my first D&D session. It was awesome. It was amazing. But yeah, I never really sat down to play like that much, because especially like when you're in school, I mean, you have like a lot of stuff going on. But then so I would play it on and off, and then, but the first sort of like big kind of campaign, as it's called, was in high school, and it was around the time I was about to graduate, and that was probably like the longest kind of running like campaign that sort of lasted for a little while, like over a few months. And from there I really got I mean, I'd always been into like Lord of the Rings, and I was reading The Wheel of Time, so I was always into, like, I always wanted to write something like that, and so the campaign kind of jump-started that for me. But yeah, kind of fast-forwarding to years later, and I'm doing freelance illustrations, which was, I mean, part of my goals and stuff, part of, I guess, my dreams or for my career. And and I kind of wanted to get back into D&D, but but yeah, I mean, like, kind of the older you get, the harder that becomes. And so I ended up just creating some characters, and at first, so there were like a few attempts to kind of get into it, but it just didn't happen. So this character, I just created, and I was thinking, well, maybe I'll just create like a female character and see what happens. And so that's how I came up with her. In fact, let me just kind of sketch, like, so here's another story for another day, but I had all this artwork, but I had to get rid of it, including the original sketch of this character. But yeah, that's kind of another story, which I may or may not share, but it was kind of traumatic. But yeah, that, like, all my portfolios and sketchbooks and stuff, that's why I don't really have any sketchbooks other than the ones that I currently am working on. I'll kind of sketch her, what I remember of her original kind of look. So I'm just going to sketch from imagination. I remember her picture being kind of like from a 3/4 view. It's being recorded. So it's already been about 30 minutes, so you might want to take a break from my story. I'm going to continue here. What was I going to say? So yeah, when I created her, she was a rogue, and I was just coming up with, I was just using like a character creation thing, and like, you could pick flaws and stuff like that, because I mean, at this point, the internet was around, and so yeah, there were like different ways of creating characters, and so she was just originally like this rogue, and it was saying to come up with like the background and everything, and so she's changed quite a bit is my point, but like originally that was like the idea. And that's as far as I got, like, with her, was like, I thought like maybe I was gonna be a player like in the game, and someone else would run the game, and so I thought, yeah, maybe I'll just play like this female character, because I don't think I've ever done that. But it never happened. Like, the game never happened, so I just put her away. And then a few years later, I was like, okay, well, I thought, well, maybe I'll create like a campaign, and I'll just run the game. And so I decided to create some like characters just to have as NPCs or like potential player characters. And so I did that, and one of the main characters, so this particular character was sort of out of the picture. And so yeah, I just kind of created like kind of this group, and the main character there was this female bard, and I made her kind of the opposite of this one. So this is like a rogue and a thief, but then, and like a swordsman, but then the bard was kind of the opposite. And then I created just other characters that kind of, and it was sort of the stereotypical kind of D&D thing, because you kind of need like a healer and a fighter and stuff like that. So it's kind of generic, which I don't mind. I mean, it's all right. If the story is good, it doesn't really bother me. Plus, if you don't play D&D like that much anyway, like they're going to be pretty generic, because that's the only game that you're playing. So so that's how I came up with like a new group of characters. But the game didn't happen, like the campaign didn't happen, but I was creating like the kind of like world building. So that was like when I started. I mean, I've always done some world building, but that's when I started like thinking about it more. And so that's where that kind of came from, like the kind of like the world that I'm working on now, like the world building, as far as like the map and stuff. But then somehow this character, so I guess when I started turning it into like more of a story, because I saw that the game wasn't going to happen, then I was like, well, maybe I can use these characters for like a story, just like for like a book. And so I was playing around with that idea and just kind of playing around with world building. And then this character, which we're calling D, like she just kind of showed up because maybe I needed someone like a character kind of like that. And so she just sort of showed up into the story, and she kind of took over. And that's kind of how it works. Like, she just sort of does her own thing. And I don't really know why, but I'm compelled to tell her story. Now, the other characters, they also have their own story, and it's all part of it. And the other thing is also, this is actually so, I've drawn her several times, but I haven't really settled on a look. So this one was kind of like the first look, like her hair was back and like it was kind of long. And, but yeah, like I was kind of just experimenting, but I mean, she always kind of had like the vibe, with dark hair and stuff. But over time, like over the years, her story has changed, and like her look and stuff. And as it stands right now, like I'm kind of telling an origin story, like the way I have it kind of set up, like plotted out, which I'm not a huge fan of, but I mean, it can be okay. Like, but sometimes I know that origin stories are kind of boring. So there's like more characters, because since I started thinking about it like a novel, there's more characters and more of the world I gotta design, and it kind of turned into like this origin story for her. She turned into a half demon rogue. And so I was thinking, well, why doesn't she look more like a demon? And then also just along the same lines, D&D like went through several editions, and I didn't play it. I mean, I like so it's funny because I haven't actually played it like a lot, like just actually. And so also my like I didn't keep up with all the different editions, but I kind of checked it out later on, and apparently they came up with a tiefling, which is kind of like I guess a half demon. I don't know, some kind of thing like that. But then yeah, it kind of made me think, well, why doesn't she look like that or something? Which is not to say that I have to make her like a D&D character, but which it's not like now. But yeah, so then I kind of had to explain stuff like that, like in the story. So that's how I came up with some of the lore. So just to kind of come back around to what we were focused on, which is partly just me sketching here, but also you sketching along or just listening, is that, well, one, I mean, I obviously have a lot more to sort of say about the story, but then there's the whole thing of not spoiling it, because now that it's a novel that I'm writing. But also the comic that I'm doing, it's basically I just put her into it, which is actually like the first time I've drawn her in a comic, and so that helps a lot. I was mentioning how it helps to just have something to look at. And it kind of helps bring the character to life, and yeah, just kind of going back to what I was saying about like her design, like that helps a lot, like to just kind of settle on a look, because now that you're drawing a comic, or that I'm drawing a comic, but yeah, I have a lot of stories about how I came up with these ideas. And what I like about writing, like just kind of coming up with a story, is that the side characters, as it were, are just as interesting, if not more interesting. So like, even though she's basically the main character, like there's going to be different like POV characters, and they're just as interesting to me, which I like. I like that it's like that. That means it's an interesting story. And also going back to what I was saying about like the character design, like I've drawn her in different sketches and even portraits and stuff, and I've even done kind of a character sheet, but for some reason, maybe it's because of the comic, I don't know, or maybe just like I'm drawing her like better, like more consistently. So like this page, I just kind of felt inspired yesterday to start sketching it, and that's kind of why like I'm not even able to go to sleep, because I wanted to keep working on it, because like it's starting to come to life. Like this could actually be reference for me. But what was I gonna say? Well, I mean, I'll start to kind of wrap this up, because now it's at 40 minutes. But if you've made it this far, thank you. maybe I either enticed you with the story or with the artwork or both. But yeah, it was fun. And I think that's all I got to say for now about this. One thing is, as I kind of wrap it up, is like one of the things that I'm just interested in right now is drawing from like, you can see, like, just out of imagination, although this is a character that I have an idea about. But yeah, that was the other thing I was gonna say, is like I'm still experimenting with like the look of it. What I like is that the character can still be the same character, even though maybe like these could be different actresses, which is kind of another story, another idea. But yeah, thanks for joining me today for our daily sketching routine. Thank you for supporting the channel. I really appreciate it. And until next time, keep on sketching.